At the funeral of her late husband, Martha's life is shattered. Her family, once united by love, turns against her, fighting for control of her inheritance. Alone, neglected, and betrayed, she uncovers a hidden fortune that could change everything. But with power comes danger. Can she reclaim her life from those who betrayed her, or will revenge consume her? Watch as she faces a decision that will alter her fate forever. Martha had always been the center of her family's world. Or at least that's how it had seemed when she was younger. Now, sitting alone on her old, creaky rocking chair by the window, it seemed like the family had drifted far from her grasp. The house that once echoed with laughter now stood silent, almost as though it, too, had forgotten the joy it once held. At 72, Martha had seen the sun rise and set countless times, but none of those days felt as lonely as the one she was living through now. The last few years had been a slow unraveling for her. Her children, once eager to spend time with her, had slowly become more distant. Her sons, George and Frank, had both married and they were busy with their own lives. Work, children, their own families. They would visit, but only when it was convenient for them. Martha, despite her pride, could not help but feel the sting of neglect. But it wasn't just neglect. It was the feeling that her own blood had turned away from her. And the worst part? Martha had no idea why. Her husband, Edward, had passed away a decade ago, and while his absence still hurt, she had managed to fill the empty space with her work and her family. She was no stranger to grief, but Martha knew something had changed over the years. The tension in the air had grown thick, like an unsaid word between them all, hanging heavy but never being spoken aloud. They had always been a close-knit family, or so she had thought. But now, everything seemed fractured, like a glass vase that had been dropped, but the cracks were too small to notice at first. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The day it all began to unravel was the day she learned of her inheritance. It was a day that started like any other, with the warmth of sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. But it was also the day Martha realized just how easily love could be replaced by greed. The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Martha had been in the garden, tending to her rose bushes, when she saw the envelope resting on the hallway table. She picked it up, recognizing the formal handwriting immediately. It was from the law firm of Carter, Simmons and Calloway, the firm her late husband had used for years. The moment she opened it, her eyes scanned the contents quickly, her heartbeat speeding up as she read the words aloud in disbelief. Dear Mrs. Martha Lawson, we are writing to inform you of the inheritance left to you by your late husband, Mr. Edward Lawson. After reviewing the will and the estate, we wish to discuss the details with you at your earliest convenience. Please contact our office to schedule an appointment. The letter itself was not alarming, but what it revealed, or more importantly what it did not reveal, was what truly set Martha on edge. Edward had been a successful businessman. His wealth had been built from decades of hard work. And although he had never flaunted it, Martha knew that there was more to the estate than she had ever imagined. But there had never been any talk of it. No mention of what would happen when he was gone, no hint of how much he had left behind. She folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter, her mind racing. Was this what she had been waiting for? Was this the reason her children had grown distant? She had tried to brush off the unsettling feeling in her stomach. But now, with this unexpected communication, everything seemed to make sense. She needed answers. And she needed them now. The call to the law firm was short and to the point. The receptionist informed her that the meeting would take place the following Monday. That gave Martha a few days to stew over the possibilities. She spent the weekend in restless contemplation, her mind turning over the implications of the inheritance. Edward had always been practical, never one for lavish gestures. But something told her that there was more to this inheritance than simple wealth. It was something deeper, something tied to the family's legacy. When Monday came, Martha dressed carefully, wearing the pearl necklace Edward had given her on their anniversary. She could still remember that day, his warm smile, the way his eyes lit up when he handed her the box. Felt like another lifetime. Her children had not accompanied her to the meeting, which struck her as odd, but she put it out of her mind as she made her way to the law firm's office. The building was sleek and modern, with glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Martha hesitated at the entrance before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The firm's office smelled of leather and polished wood, a cold, professional atmosphere that made Martha feel small. The receptionist smiled politely and directed her to a conference room where the partners would meet her. As she sat down, the walls of the room seemed to close in on her, and she felt the weight of her years, the memories of a life well lived, all pressing down on her chest. Minutes later, two men walked into the room. One was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair and a sharp suit. The other was younger, maybe in his 30s, with a clean-shaven face and a polished demeanor. They introduced themselves as Mr. Simmons and Mr. Calloway, partners at the firm. Martha could feel her heart pounding as they sat across from her, their expressions unreadable.
"Mrs. Lawson," Mr. Simmons began, his voice smooth and calm. "I'm sure you're eager to hear the details of your husband's estate." He paused, glancing at Mr. Calloway, who nodded slightly. "We've reviewed everything, and it seems your late husband left you in sole possession of the family's assets," Mr. Calloway continued, "as well as the estate." His words were clear, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She nodded slowly, her mind processing the words. "And my children? What about them?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Both men exchanged a glance, a flicker of something Martha couldn't quite read in their eyes. "Your sons, George and Frank," Mr. Simmons said, "are listed as beneficiaries, but they will not receive any of the inheritance unless you decide otherwise." Martha's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, unless I decide otherwise?" Mr. Calloway leaned forward, his eyes now focused intently on hers. "Your husband had very specific instructions in his will. He left behind a considerable fortune, more than you might have anticipated. But he also wanted to ensure that the inheritance went to someone who could manage it properly." He paused again, his words hanging heavily in the air. "Your sons, your family, are not entitled to a single penny unless you, Mrs. Lawson, decide to grant it to them." Martha's mind was reeling. She had expected to inherit something substantial, but she had not anticipated this level of control. "So, you're saying that everything is in my hands? That I can decide who gets what?" "Exactly," Mr. Simmons replied, his voice flat. "But there's more, Mrs. Lawson. Your husband left behind certain stipulations for the inheritance. He felt that the family was drifting apart, and so he wanted you to have the final say on who benefits from the fortune." The room fell silent as Martha absorbed the weight of their words. Her children, the people she had raised, the ones she had loved and cared for, were not guaranteed anything. The inheritance, once thought to be the key to their future, was now a weapon, and Martha was its wielder. "I understand," Martha said slowly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll need some time to think about this." "Of course," Mr. Simmons said, standing up. "Take all the time you need. But remember, your decision will shape the future of this family." As Martha left the law firm, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had no idea what her children would say when they learned of the inheritance, but one thing was certain: they would not be happy. And that, she knew, was only the beginning.
Martha returned home that evening, the weight of the law firm's revelations still pressing down on her. The house was just as she had left it, silent, with the faint smell of dinner lingering in the air. She had not made any arrangements for dinner, but she wasn't hungry. Her mind was too occupied with the inheritance, the control she now had over her family's fate, and the unsettling feeling in her gut. She placed the letter from the law firm on the kitchen counter and leaned against the doorframe, staring out into the garden. The sight of the overgrown roses and the dying hydrangeas reminded her of her late husband, Edward, who had always taken care of the yard. She had tried to keep up with the maintenance since his passing, but it was getting harder with each passing year. Edward had been the rock of their family, the one who always held everything together even when things were falling apart. Now it felt like the cracks were starting to show, and Martha didn't know how much longer she could keep it all from breaking. Her children, George and Frank, had never been perfect, but they had always been close. Or so she had thought. Martha remembered the days when they would play together in the backyard, laughing and chasing each other around. Now it seemed like their only concerns were their own lives, their own families, and their own agendas. Martha had always felt like a distant figure in their lives, but now she wondered if they had ever truly seen her. She was just a vessel for their inheritance, a means to an end. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron before picking up the receiver. It was George, her eldest son. She had not spoken to him much since the meeting at the law firm, and she had to admit that a part of her dreaded this conversation. "Hello, Mom." George's voice was warm, but there was an edge to it, like he was trying to mask something. "How are you? We've been meaning to visit, but things have been crazy on our end." Martha hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She didn't want to accuse him of anything just yet, but the distance in his voice, the way he avoided her questions, made her feel like he had something to hide. "I'm fine, dear. Just busy around here. How's everything with you?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "Things are fine. I just wanted to check in and see if you were doing okay. I know it's been a while since Dad passed, and I know it must be hard for you." It was hard to believe that George was truly concerned. He never called just to check on her. Something was off, and Martha could feel it. "I'm managing," Martha replied, her voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I'm not sure what to do next." "Future?" George sounded slightly confused, but Martha could hear the sharpness in his voice. "What do you mean by that?" She knew this was the moment. The truth was finally coming to the surface. "I received a letter from the law firm today. Edward's inheritance. They informed me of the stipulations in his will." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that made Martha's skin crawl. "What stipulations?" George finally asked, his voice more guarded now. Martha took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her chest. "It seems that Edward left everything to me with the power to decide who gets what. It's not automatic, George. Your share is not guaranteed unless I decide to give it to you." For a moment there was no response, and then George's voice came through, tight with something Martha couldn't quite place. "What are you talking about, Mom? You're not seriously considering cutting us out of the inheritance, are you?" Martha's heart raced and her grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not cutting anyone out, George. But I have the final say. Edward's will made that clear. I need to think about this carefully." George's voice grew louder. "You don't have to think about it, Mom. We're family. You can't keep us from what's rightfully ours. We've been through so much, and now you're saying we're not entitled to anything." Martha flinched at the anger in his voice. This wasn't the son she had raised. "I'm not saying that, George," she said softly, her voice wavering. "But I need time. There are things I have to consider." There was a harsh laugh on the other end. "Time? We don't have time, Mom. You've had time. You've had years. You don't need to think about this any longer." Martha's blood ran cold. She could hear the desperation in George's voice, the urgency that bordered on demand. "I'll let you know when I've made a decision," she said, her voice firm. "And that's final." Before she could say another word, George hung up. Martha stood there for a moment, the weight of the conversation sinking in. She had always known that her children weren't as close as they had once been, but this was different. This wasn't just distance. It was coldness, a blatant disregard for her wishes, for her feelings. She had raised them, loved them, but in the end, it was clear that they were only interested in one thing: the inheritance.
The phone call had left her shaken, but it also steeled her resolve. She had always been the glue that held this family together, but now she had to make a decision that would determine the course of her life, and theirs. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. And power, she realized, could change everything. Later that evening, Martha sat alone in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The house felt colder than it ever had, and she felt the distance between her and her family growing wider by the second. She thought back to the days when George and Frank were children, when they looked up to her, when they came running to her for comfort and advice. Now it felt as though they had no time for her, no need for her. But what hurt the most was that they had never asked her about Edward's will. They never asked her how she was feeling, what she needed. They just assumed that everything would fall into place, that the inheritance would be theirs by right. And now they were demanding it. Martha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. She hesitated, wondering if it was one of her sons, but when she opened the door she was surprised to see Frank standing there, his face tense. "Mom, we need to talk," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Martha's heart skipped a beat. She had not expected Frank to come over, especially not after the phone call with George. But here he was, his expression serious, his posture stiff. She closed the door behind him, trying to read his face. "What is it, Frank?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. "We've heard about the will," Frank said, his voice low. "And I think we need to have a serious discussion about it. You can't just keep everything for yourself, Mom. You know we deserve a share." Martha's breath caught in her throat. The same words, the same demands. It was like déjà vu, only now it was coming from Frank too. She had known that George would feel entitled, but Frank's words were just as sharp, just as demanding. "Is that what this is about?" Martha asked, her voice cold. "You think you deserve it just because you're my sons?" Frank's face flushed with anger. "You don't understand, Mom. It's not just about the money. It's about family, about loyalty. You can't just cut us out." Martha felt the anger rising in her chest. "Loyalty? What loyalty? You've both ignored me for years. And now you think you can walk in here and demand what's mine? What's wrong with you, Frank?" Frank took a step back as if shocked by her words. For a moment the room was silent. Then slowly he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to upset you. But you have to understand, we're not trying to hurt you. We just want what's fair." Martha stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, her mind racing. Fair. Fair was never a part of this family. Fair had died the moment Edward had passed away. The love, the respect, all of it had been replaced by greed and entitlement. She looked at Frank, her son, the one who had always been there for her. Or so she had thought. Now she saw only a man who was desperate for money, who was ready to betray his own mother for the sake of a fortune. And Martha realized then, with a sharp clarity, that everything was about to change.
The next few days passed in a blur for Martha. The discussions with her sons had left her shaken, and the weight of the inheritance was growing heavier by the minute. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her children, the familiar warmth now replaced by suspicion, greed, and a thirst for power. She had never imagined that her own flesh and blood would turn against her so easily. It was as if they saw her only as a conduit for money, a tool to be used and discarded when they had taken what they wanted. Martha was no longer the woman she used to be. The old, fragile mother figure who had been content with her quiet life had disappeared. Now she was something else. Someone who understood the true nature of her family's ambitions. They were not just fighting for money, they were fighting for control. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She had to take control of her own life before anyone else decided it for her. As Martha walked through the house that evening, the sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty halls, a constant reminder of the loneliness she now felt. Edward had been the one to keep everything together, the one who had always known what to say and how to make her feel secure. But now he was gone, and Martha was left to face a world she hadn't prepared for. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the rooms now seeming empty and oppressive, like they were watching her every move. Martha sat down at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she poured herself a glass of water. She hadn't eaten much in the past few days, her stomach too knotted with anxiety. The law firm's letter lay in front of her, the same one that had caused all of this. She had been reading it over and over as if it held the key to some solution, some way out of the nightmare that had become her reality. But the truth was, she had no idea what to do next. Her sons were pressuring her, each with their own agenda, each with their own demands. They wanted her to give them what they thought was rightfully theirs. But Martha was starting to understand that the inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about something deeper. It was about power, who held it, who controlled it, and who got to decide what was fair. Martha had always been a passive participant in her family's decisions, letting Edward take the lead, trusting him to handle the difficult choices. But now she was faced with the choice of whether to hold on to the power that had been handed to her, or to surrender it to her sons who saw it as their birthright. The thought of giving up control to them made her stomach turn. She had worked too hard, had lived too long in the shadows of their expectations, to just let them take everything. She was more than just a figurehead in this family. She had a voice, she had strength, and she would use it to her advantage. But as the days wore on, the pressure from George and Frank only intensified. Martha knew that they were watching her, waiting for her to make a decision. They had already begun to divide the estate in their minds, imagining how they would spend the money, how they would secure their futures. They were already planning their lives without her in it, and it made Martha feel like a mere afterthought, a woman who had outlived her usefulness. On the third day after Frank's visit, Martha found herself standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at the family portraits hanging on the walls. The faces of her ancestors stared back at her, their eyes cold and distant as though they were judging her. What would they have done in her position? Would they have fought for what was theirs, or would they have bowed to their children's demands? Martha's hands clenched into fists as she made her decision. She was not going to be a victim. She was not going to let her sons tear her apart just to claim what they thought was theirs. She would fight for what was hers, and she would do whatever it took to keep her family from exploiting her. This inheritance was not just about money. It was about her dignity, her honor, and her place in the world. No one would take that from her. Later that evening, Martha sat down with the letter from the law firm and began to write. She knew that this would be the letter that would change everything. She wasn't sure how her sons would react, but she was ready for the storm that would come. She would fight for herself even if it meant losing everything else. The letter was a formal request to the law firm, detailing her wishes regarding the inheritance. She had decided to take full control of the estate, to dictate who received what and on her own terms. She would not be swayed by her sons' demands or their sense of entitlement. This was her decision and hers alone. As she signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope, a sense of calm washed over her. For the first time in days, she felt in control of her life again. The power was back in her hands where it belonged.
The next morning, Martha sent the letter to the law firm, and by the afternoon her sons had been informed of her decision. She could already hear the murmurs of disapproval, the anger in their voices as they read the letter, but she didn't care. She had made her choice, and now it was time to face the consequences. That evening, the doorbell rang and Martha knew immediately who it was. She opened the door to find George standing on the porch, his face red with anger. Behind him stood Frank, looking equally displeased. The moment they saw her, they both stepped forward, their eyes flashing with frustration. "Mom, what is this?" George demanded, holding up the letter. "This isn't fair. You can't just take everything for yourself. We're your family. We've been here for you all these years, and now you're going to turn your back on us." Martha stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. "You have no idea what it's been like, George. You and Frank have taken everything for granted. You think you deserve this inheritance just because you're my sons. But I'm the one who worked for it, who lived through the pain, the sacrifices, and the struggles. I've earned this, and I will not let you take it from me." Frank stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can control everything, Mom? You've had your turn. It's ours now. You can't keep playing these games. You need to stop this before it's too late." Martha's heart raced as she looked at them, her sons. Once the center of her world, now her greatest threat. She knew that the fight she had started would not be an easy one. But she also knew that she couldn't let them take what was hers. She had to stand her ground. "I've made my decision," Martha said, her voice calm but resolute. "And I'm not going back on it. If you want what's mine, you'll have to take it from me." George and Frank exchanged a look, their anger evident, but Martha saw something else in their eyes: fear. They were afraid. They were afraid of losing everything, afraid of their own weakness, and that fear gave Martha the power she needed to stand tall. As the door closed behind them, Martha stood in the hallway, breathing heavily. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The battle for control of her family's legacy had begun.
The following days were filled with tension. Martha's decision to take control of the inheritance had stirred something inside her sons, a fire that seemed to burn brighter with each passing day. George and Frank were no longer the young men who had relied on her. They were embittered, determined to fight for what they believed was their birthright. But what they hadn't counted on was the strength Martha had rediscovered within herself. The woman they had once underestimated was no longer docile. She was resolute and prepared to face whatever consequences came her way. The house, once a sanctuary of warmth, now felt like a battlefield. Every room echoed with silence, and the walls seemed to close in on Martha as she tried to carry on with her daily life. She knew things could never go back to the way they were. The quiet family gatherings, the easy conversations over dinner, the closeness that had once defined their bond. Those days were over. Her sons had made it clear that they didn't care about her. They cared about what she could give them. As Martha sat by the fire in the living room one evening, her thoughts returned to the day Edward passed away. It had been a quiet affair with just the family at his side. In the weeks that followed, Martha had kept herself busy, trying not to think too much about what the future held. But as the inheritance discussions escalated, she could no longer ignore the tension that had seeped into every conversation, every glance. George had already begun hinting at his plans for the property, even though Martha had made it clear that she wasn't ready to divide the estate. Then there was Frank, who, like a shadow, seemed to haunt her every move. He had been the most respectful of the two, but that respect had come with strings attached. Frank wasn't interested in being a son anymore. He was interested in the power he believed he was entitled to. And now Martha realized he was no different from George. Both were blinded by greed. One morning, as Martha walked into the study, her eyes fell on the photograph of Edward that still sat on the desk. He had been her partner, the one person who understood her in ways no one else could. Their marriage had been one of quiet strength. But now Edward was gone, and all that remained were the ghosts of their past, memories tainted by the present conflict. Martha had never thought of herself as a fighter, but in the weeks since Edward's passing, she had been pushed to the brink. Her sons had underestimated her, thinking that she would simply hand over the inheritance and let them fight it out between themselves. But she was done being passive. She was done being the widow in the background, the woman whose opinions were ignored. The estate was hers and she would not let it slip through her fingers. The decision was made. Martha would fight for her legacy. It was a week after her confrontation with her sons when she received an unexpected visit from the law firm handling Edward's estate. She had half expected it to be from one of her sons, demanding to know why she was dragging things out. But when she opened the door, there stood a lawyer, a young woman who looked too polished to be dealing with something as messy as this family dispute. "Mrs. Hargrove?" the lawyer asked, her voice soft yet firm. "Yes," Martha replied, stepping aside to let the woman in. "I'm here regarding the estate," the lawyer continued. "There are some pressing matters that need to be resolved." Martha nodded, leading her into the sitting room. "Please sit down." The lawyer wasted no time. She handed Martha a folder, and Martha could see her sons' names on the papers inside. The lawyer had come to discuss the division of the estate, something that was becoming more urgent by the day. George had already made his intentions clear. He wanted control of the property and he was willing to fight for it. "I'm afraid the situation is growing more complicated," the lawyer said. "Your sons have both made claims and we need to proceed with the will's reading as soon as possible." Martha's eyes narrowed. She had expected this. Her sons wanted the estate and now they were going to take it. But she was ready for this. "I want to make something clear," Martha said, her voice steady. "I'm not handing this over easily. My husband's wishes were for the estate to be preserved, not divided up between those who think they deserve it. I intend to honor that." The lawyer looked taken aback, but she quickly composed herself. "Of course, Mrs. Hargrove. But the legal process must be followed. You can't simply stop the process." "I'm not trying to stop it," Martha replied. "But I'll make sure that everything is handled according to Edward's will. If George and Frank want their shares, they'll have to prove they deserve them." The lawyer hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else you should know. There are conditions in the will regarding how the estate should be distributed. Your sons may not be aware of them." Martha felt a twinge of curiosity. Edward had never been one to hide things, but there had always been a sense of mystery about their finances. Edward was a private man, and his business dealings were often discussed only in whispers. But now it seemed that he had left her something more than just a legacy. He had left her a weapon. "What do you mean?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There are stipulations in the will that could change the way the estate is divided, the lawyer replied. Your sons won't like it. But it is in the best interest of the estate. Martha felt a rush of emotion, fear, excitement, and a strange sense of power all at once. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Edward's will might just be the thing that could help her keep control. If you have any questions, we can go through the details, the lawyer added. But I need your signature to move forward with the process. Martha took the folder and opened it. She scanned the documents, her mind racing. If what the lawyer said was true, she had the power to change everything. But it wouldn't be easy. She knew her sons would fight her at every turn. They would stop at nothing to get what they thought they were owed. As Martha signed the documents, she realized the full weight of the decision she had made. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. This was about her family, and how far they would go to destroy each other for power. Her sons would never understand. They had no idea what she was capable of. They thought they could walk all over her, that she would simply hand over everything and disappear into the background. But Martha wasn't disappearing. Not this time. As the lawyer left, Martha sat back in her chair, feeling a strange sense of calm. She had taken the first step. The battle had begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. The storm was coming, and Martha was prepared to weather it.
The next few days after the signing of the documents were filled with an eerie calmness, almost like the calm before a storm. Martha found herself pacing through the halls of the estate. The same house that had once been filled with laughter and joy now felt like a battleground, each corner shadowed by the looming conflict with her sons. She could feel the pressure mounting, not just from the legal aspects of the inheritance, but from the deep emotional divide growing between her and George and Frank. Her sons, the two people she had raised, loved, and nurtured, were now her adversaries. Their loyalty had been replaced by an insatiable hunger for wealth, and that hunger seemed to have clouded their judgment. It had always been George, the older son, who had held the reins of the family. He was ambitious, driven, and a natural leader, or so it seemed. Frank, on the other hand, had been more quiet, introspective, and respectful, but it was clear now that he was not as innocent as he appeared. The tension between the brothers had been there for years, simmering beneath the surface, but Martha had never imagined it would boil over like this. As the days passed, George's calls became more frequent, and each conversation seemed to carry with it an underlying threat. His voice was smooth, but Martha could hear the impatience creeping through the cracks. Frank, though he said less, had started to distance himself from her, his coldness a stark contrast to the son she had once cherished. Martha knew that they were plotting against her, trying to divide the estate behind her back. They thought she was old, weak, and easily swayed by their demands. But Martha had learned a long time ago how to mask her true intentions. She wasn't going to make the mistake of showing her hand too early. She had to play this game carefully, with precision and cunning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sprawling estate, Martha received an unexpected visitor, her lawyer. This time the lawyer didn't come with just paperwork or legal jargon. This time the lawyer came with news that Martha had been dreading. "It's happening, Mrs. Hargrove," the lawyer said, her voice filled with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "Your sons are moving forward with a claim on the estate." Martha's heart sank, but she didn't let her emotions show. She had suspected as much, but hearing the words aloud made the reality of the situation much more tangible. "They're doing this behind my back, aren't they?" Martha asked, her voice low but firm. The lawyer nodded. "Yes. They've made arrangements to petition the court for control over the estate. They believe they have the right to take over everything." Martha felt the cold chill of betrayal sweep over her. It was no surprise that George would try something like this. He had always been driven by power. But Frank, her younger son, the one she thought had been more compassionate, had sided with George. Martha had raised both of them to understand the value of hard work and integrity, but somewhere along the way greed had twisted their sense of family. The same family that had once been her pride and joy was now tearing itself apart, all for the sake of money. Martha stood up, her knees steady despite the emotional toll. "We need to stop them. I will not let them take what rightfully belongs to us." The The lawyer hesitated, clearly aware of the difficulty of the task ahead. It won't be easy, Mrs. Hargrove. The legal battle will be long and the outcome uncertain. Your sons will fight this with everything they have. Martha nodded. I've lived through worse. The lawyer studied her for a moment, then handed Martha a folder. I've prepared a plan of action, but it will require more than just legal maneuvering. You'll need to make some difficult decisions. Martha opened the folder and scanned through the papers. It was clear that the battle had escalated beyond what she had anticipated. But she wasn't going to back down. She had spent too many years building this estate with Edward, and she would not let it be dismantled by her own flesh and blood. The lawyer left and Martha sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her sons were not the people she had once known. They had become strangers to her, driven by a hunger for something that could never be fulfilled. They wanted power, control, and wealth, but they didn't understand the price of those things. It was then that Martha realized the truth. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't even about the estate. This was about something deeper. A struggle for control, for respect, for dignity. George and Frank had betrayed her, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. The following morning, as Martha walked through the house, she noticed the subtle changes. The once familiar rooms now seemed cold, distant. The portraits of her family on the walls, once a reminder of happy memories, now seemed to mock her. Her sons had turned their backs on her, and the house, her sanctuary, had become a prison. She had to act fast. Time was running out, and the longer she waited, the more difficult it would be to reclaim what was hers. The next day, Martha arranged a meeting with George and Frank. It was time to confront them, to lay all the cards on the table and make them understand that she was not a weak woman. She was not a pawn in their game of power. She was their mother, and she would fight for what was rightfully hers. As she prepared for the meeting, Martha couldn't help but reflect on the years that had passed, the sacrifices she had made, the struggles she had endured. She had given everything to her family, and now they were trying to take it all away. But she would not let that happen. Not without a fight. When the time came, George and Frank arrived at the house, their faces hard with determination. They walked into the sitting room where Martha sat waiting for them, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. "Martha, we need to talk," George said, his voice cold. "I think we've talked enough," Martha replied, her tone firm. "I know what you're planning, and I'm not going to let you take this estate from me." Frank shifted uncomfortably, but George stood his ground. "You're not in control here, Mother. This estate is ours now. We've been patient long enough." Martha stood up slowly, her gaze never leaving George. "You think you can take everything I've worked for, everything Edward and I built, just because you're my sons? You're wrong. You're both wrong." The confrontation had begun, and Martha knew this would be the fight of her life. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the decisions she had made, the sacrifices she had endured. But she also felt something else, a sense of resolve that had been growing inside her, a fire that had been lit by their betrayal. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever.
Martha stood at the window of her office, watching as the first rays of dawn bathed the estate in a soft golden glow. The sprawling grounds stretched out before her, each corner of the property once a testament to the life she had built with Edward. But now, the land that had been a sanctuary of peace was becoming the battleground for a war she never wanted. The night before, the confrontation with George and Frank had not gone as Martha had hoped. Their arrogance, their sense of entitlement, it was almost too much to bear. The words they had thrown at her were sharp, calculated. But through it all, Martha remained calm, steady, even as her heart broke at the thought of how her sons had betrayed her. They hadn't even tried to understand. They hadn't listened to her, nor had they considered the sacrifices she had made to give them the life they had now. They were blinded by greed, by their desire to own everything, and they had forgotten the most important thing: family. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Martha had spent the better part of the night going through legal documents, reviewing contracts, and reflecting on what she could do next. She had a plan, one that was far more intricate than they could ever imagine. The inheritance battle wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about reclaiming her dignity and standing firm in the face of betrayal. And she would fight with every ounce of strength she had left. Later that day, Martha met with her lawyer, Julia. The younger woman had been working with Martha for years, and although she was just starting out in her career, she had quickly earned Martha's respect. Julia was sharp, diligent, and fiercely loyal. She understood the stakes. "We have to act fast," Martha said, her voice low but filled with resolve. "George and Frank won't stop until they have control, and if I wait too long, they'll push forward with their plan." Julia nodded, flipping through the papers Martha had given her. "You're right. I've been looking over the will and your assets, and there's a way we can fight this. But it's going to take some careful maneuvering. They think they've got the upper hand, but we can outsmart them." Martha's eyes glinted with a mixture of pain and determination. "They don't realize who they're up against. They've underestimated me, Julia. And that's a mistake they'll regret." Julia paused, meeting Martha's gaze. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to play my final card," Martha said, her voice steady. "I'm going to use their greed against them." The plan was simple but dangerous. Martha knew that George and Frank were already fighting over the estate in the open, but she had learned something valuable in the past few days. Their greed had blindsided them. They didn't care about the family legacy or the history of the estate. They only cared about the money and the power it could give them. They were making decisions without fully understanding the consequences. But Martha knew better. If we can prove that the estate was not in their rightful possession, that they didn't follow the legal steps properly, we can claim it back, Julia explained, her fingers flying over the keyboard of her laptop. "We need to gather evidence that shows they've acted out of line with your father's will. That could give us a strong case in court." Martha nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. It was risky, but it was the only way to take back control. She wasn't going to let her sons turn her home into a commodity to be fought over and discarded. For the next few days, Martha and Julia worked together in secrecy, collecting evidence, making calls, and reviewing every last document related to the estate. It was a meticulous process, one that required patience and cunning. But Martha was no stranger to hard work, and she had already been through so much in her life. Losing her family, losing her dignity, was simply not an option. Meanwhile, George and Frank were not idle. They continued their efforts to seize control of the estate, bringing in their own lawyers and pressuring the court to act quickly. They were confident, convinced that their mother's age and vulnerability would play in their favor. They had no idea what Martha had in store for them. One morning, as Martha sat at the kitchen table sipping her tea, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she was met with the sight of Frank, standing in the doorway with a smug look on his face. "Martha, we need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Martha stood still, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Frank?" Frank's eyes scanned the room, taking in the grandeur of the estate as if it belonged to him. "I think it's time you accepted reality. This house, this entire estate, it's ours now. George and I are taking control. You can either go quietly or make this difficult for yourself." Martha felt a wave of anger rise within her, but she kept her composure. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "This estate is mine. And you won't take it from me." Frank's smile faded, replaced by a hard look. "Don't be foolish. There's nothing you can do to stop us." "Is that so?" Martha replied, her voice colder now. "Because I've just learned something you don't know. You're acting without the legal right to do so. You've made some very costly mistakes." Frank narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Martha straightened, her gaze unwavering. "I've been working with my lawyer, Frank. And what we've uncovered could cost you everything. You may have convinced yourselves you can run this place, but you've forgotten one thing. You never had the legal authority to do so." Frank's confident posture faltered for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" Martha smiled, but it was a smile of quiet vengeance. "The will, Frank. The will that Edward left. You didn't follow the procedures. You're not the rightful heirs. And I've got the proof." Frank's expression turned dark. "You're bluffing." "No, Frank," Martha said, stepping closer. "I'm not bluffing. This is over. You and George have lost. Frank stood frozen for a moment, then turned and stormed out of the room, muttering under his breath. Martha watched him go, a surge of triumph filling her chest. But there was no time to celebrate. She knew that Frank wouldn't take this lying down. He would fight back and George would likely follow suit. But Martha was ready. She had waited long enough. It was only a matter of time before the battle would reach its peak. Martha had set her plan in motion, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her. The next few days were tense, filled with phone calls and meetings as both sides prepared for what was sure to be a long and brutal legal battle. But Martha was undeterred. She was determined to reclaim what was rightfully hers, not just for herself but for the legacy of her husband, Edward. The Hargrove estate had once been a symbol of wealth, power, and family. But now it was a battleground. And Martha Hargrove was ready to fight for it with everything she had.
Martha sat quietly in her study, the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock her only company. The house was eerily still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to hit. She had known this day would come, but now that it was upon her, the weight of it all felt heavier than she had expected. Frank and George would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and Martha was ready to fight with everything she had. The previous weeks had been a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, each move a calculated step toward reclaiming the estate. She had watched her sons slip further into their greed, their once warm smiles now replaced with cold, calculating glares. They believed they were in control, but they had no idea just how far Martha had gone to secure her victory. Julia, her trusted lawyer, had become more than just an advisor. She was now Martha's ally in this war, helping her strategize and prepare for the courtroom battle that would decide the fate of everything Martha had worked for. Together they had uncovered the flaws in George and Frank's claim to the estate, flaws that would prove fatal for them once they were revealed. Martha knew that her sons were no strangers to manipulation, but they had underestimated her. Underestimated the power of her resolve. Underestimated the depth of her love for the home she had built with Edward. The home that had once been filled with laughter and warmth, and now threatened to be torn apart by the greed of those she loved most. The estate was more than just property. It was a legacy. It was a symbol of everything she and Edward had worked for, everything they had sacrificed. And Martha would not let that legacy be tainted by the ambition of her sons. The day of the hearing arrived and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Martha, dressed in her finest suit, sat at the head of the table in the large conference room, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Julia sat beside her, going over the final points of their argument. The room was filled with tension, as if the walls themselves could feel the gravity of the situation. George and Frank arrived moments later, their faces tight with anger. They had clearly underestimated their mother. Both were well-dressed, their expressions cold as they took their seats across from her. Frank shot Martha a glance filled with venom, while George barely spared her a glance before focusing on the lawyers beside him. "You should just give up, Mom," Frank said, his voice low but sharp. "You're wasting your time. You're not going to win this." Martha didn't respond. She wasn't interested in wasting words on him anymore. Instead, she turned her attention to the judge who had just entered the room. The hearing was about to begin. As the proceedings started, Martha listened carefully, her mind sharp and focused. The arguments presented by George and Frank's legal team were weak, relying on half-truths and assumptions. Martha had anticipated this. She knew exactly how to counter every claim they made. Every piece of evidence she had gathered over the past few weeks was strategically placed to expose the cracks in their case. Julia stood and presented their argument, detailing the legal missteps George and Frank had made, the missing signatures on critical documents, the lack of transparency in the handling of the estate. As she spoke, Martha felt a sense of pride for the young woman who had become more than just a lawyer to her. Julia had become a part of her fight. When it was Martha's turn, she stood tall, her voice calm but unwavering. "Your Honor," she began, "I never wanted this. I never wanted to fight my own sons. But they have left me no choice. This estate, this home was built with blood, sweat, and tears. It represents everything I have worked for, everything my late husband Edward worked for. I will not stand idly by while they destroy it. Martha's words were powerful, each one carrying the weight of years of sacrifice and love for the estate she had nurtured. As she spoke, she could feel the room shift. George and Frank were no longer the confident men they had been at the beginning of the hearing. They were now unsure, their expressions faltering. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern face, listened intently as Martha continued. I don't want to take everything from them. I never did. But I will not allow them to take what is rightfully mine. The courtroom fell silent. The judge nodded slowly, making a note on the paper in front of him. Martha knew that the outcome of this case would not be decided today. It would take time for the judge to make his decision, but Martha was confident that the truth would prevail. As the hearing came to a close, George and Frank stormed out of the room, muttering curses under their breath. They had no idea what they had just walked into. Martha had not only secured the legal victory, but she had also re-established her power. Back at the estate, as Martha stood alone in the grand hall, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had won the battle. But this wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done to ensure that the estate remained hers, that the legacy of her family would continue as it always had. Julia had already begun drafting the legal documents to finalize the transfer of ownership, but Martha knew that she had to be prepared for anything. George and Frank wouldn't stop fighting, and she wasn't going to let them tear apart the home she had built. Not now, not ever. The next few days were filled with anticipation as Martha waited for the judge's final ruling. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the strain of the battle was beginning to take its toll. But Martha remained resolute. She knew that the next chapter of this fight would be even more difficult than the last. Finally, the day came when the judge's decision was delivered. Martha opened the envelope slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She read the words carefully, her eyes scanning the legal jargon before her. The judge had ruled in her favor. The estate was hers. Martha felt a surge of triumph, but it was tempered by the emptiness she felt in her heart. She had won the battle, but at what cost? Her sons had turned against her. The bond they had once shared had been shattered beyond repair. She had no illusions about what this meant. She would never again be the same woman she had been before this fight began. The victory, though sweet, had come with a heavy price. But as she stood in the grand hall of the estate, looking out over the grounds that had been her sanctuary for so long, Martha knew one thing for certain. She had regained control not just of the estate but of her own life. And that, she realized, was worth more than any fortune.
The estate had been quiet for days, the heavy silence hanging over the sprawling grounds like a thick fog. Martha had won her battle in court, but she knew that the real fight was only just beginning. George and Frank, though humiliated and defeated in the eyes of the law, were far from finished. The anger in their eyes the day they left the courtroom had spoken volumes. They were determined to take what they believed was rightfully theirs. Martha's once peaceful home now felt like a battleground. The walls that had witnessed decades of joy and love now felt heavy with tension, as though they too were bracing for the inevitable storm. It was a storm Martha knew all too well. She had lived through enough heartache and betrayal to understand that this wasn't just about money. This was about power, control, and her son's insatiable greed. Every night as the wind howled outside, Martha couldn't help but reflect on the choices she had made. It wasn't just the inheritance or the estate. It was her very soul that was on the line. She had chosen to fight. And in doing so, she had lost her sons. The relationship they once shared had been poisoned by money and ambition. George and Frank were no longer the boys she had raised. They had become strangers, consumed by a desire for wealth and control. But there was no turning back now. She had chosen this path and she would follow it through to the end. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew. George and Frank had stopped speaking to her entirely, refusing to meet her eyes whenever they crossed paths in the hallways. They had become bitter, resentful figures, their arrogance replaced by thinly veiled rage. Martha, for her part, remained calm. She had learned long ago that true strength didn't come from shouting or fighting. It came from patience and resilience, from understanding that power was often most effective when wielded quietly. It was early one morning when the storm finally broke. Martha was in her study, going over the final details of the estate's transfer when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Slow, measured, and unmistakably purposeful. The door to her study opened with a soft creak and George stepped inside. His face was tight with anger, his jaw clenched as though he had been holding something in for days. Behind him stood Frank, his posture rigid, his arms crossed over his chest. "We need to talk, Mother," George said, his voice low and controlled, though there was an unmistakable venom in his tone. Martha didn't look up from the papers she was reading. She knew what was coming, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of showing it. "What is it, George?" she asked, her voice steady, calm. "I assume you're not here to congratulate me on my victory." Frank stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've won the legal battle, sure. But you're going to lose the war. You think you've beaten us? Think again. We're not done yet." Martha's eyes finally lifted from the papers, meeting Frank's cold gaze. "You've made your threats, Frank. But I'm not afraid of you or anyone else in this house. What I have done, I've done to protect what's mine. If you can't understand that, then perhaps you should leave." George scoffed, taking a step forward. "You think you've won? This estate will never be yours. It belongs to us, Mother. It always has and it always will. Your victory in court means nothing. We'll take it from you one way or another." Martha rose from her chair, her hands resting on the desk as she slowly circled around it, moving toward her sons. The calm in her demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm raging inside her. The reality of what she was about to do hit her in that moment. She wasn't just fighting for property. She was fighting for everything she had ever believed in. Her values, her integrity, her legacy. "I've fought for this estate, for the memory of your father, for the future of this family. And you think you can just take it away from me because you want it?" she said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "I raised you both. I loved you both. And this is how you repay me? With threats and lies." Frank sneered, stepping closer, his breath heavy with anger. "You think you've done what's best? You think you've earned this place? The truth is, Mother, you've always been selfish. Always. And now you're too old to see it. You think you can keep everything from us, but you're wrong. You've failed." Martha's heart broke at his words, but she refused to let the pain show. Instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes hardening. "I have never failed. Not once. And neither have you, Frank. You've just forgotten what really matters. And that's your biggest mistake." George stepped forward now, his voice dangerous. "You're a fool if you think you can keep us out of this. You're nothing but a stubborn old woman clinging to the past. And we will take everything you've worked for. It's just a matter of time." For a brief moment, Martha saw the boy he used to be in George's eyes. The boy she had raised, the boy she had loved. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man she didn't recognize. A man driven by greed, pride, and entitlement. "I may be old, George," Martha said softly, her voice steady, "but I'm not weak. I've spent my whole life building this. And I won't let you tear it down." The silence in the room was thick, the air heavy with tension. Martha could feel the weight of her son's anger, their hatred for her, but she also knew something they didn't. Something they had never understood. Power was not just about money. It was about resolve. It was about staying true to yourself even when the world tried to tear you apart. George's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white with rage. "You'll regret this, Mother. You'll see." Frank turned toward the door, his back stiff with frustration. "We'll make sure you regret it too." But before they could leave, Martha spoke again, her voice low and calm. "You're not going anywhere, not until I've had my say." George paused, his body tense, but he didn't turn around. Frank stopped as well, the door half open as if waiting for something. And then, in the quiet of the room, Martha delivered the final blow. "You both think you're entitled to this estate. But you're wrong. This is mine and it always has been. Your father and I built it together and I will not let you destroy it no matter what it takes. If you continue down this path, you'll lose everything. Your inheritance, your family, your honor. And when that happens, you'll have no one to blame but yourselves." The words hung in the air as George and Frank stood frozen in the doorway. Their mother's voice, once full of love and warmth, now held the sharpness of steel. It was a voice that spoke of power. Power earned, power held, and power that would not be relinquished without a fight. George and Frank exchanged a look, the tension palpable between them. Their faces were hard, their expressions filled with both frustration and fear. But Martha knew that fear would not be enough to stop them. She had made her choice. She had drawn her line in the sand. As they left the room without another word, Martha stood in the middle of her study, her heart pounding in her chest. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long while she felt a sense of peace.
The storm had passed. The tension that had gripped the house for so long had begun to dissipate, but the damage was done. Martha had stood her ground and her sons had for the moment retreated. But the silence in the house felt heavier than the conflict ever had. The estate, once a symbol of family unity, now felt like a lonely fortress, divided and fractured. Martha knew that her battle wasn't truly over, but she had come a long way from the vulnerable woman who had been unsure of herself all those years ago. In the days following that heated confrontation, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. The halls, which had once echoed with laughter and love, now seemed cold and distant. The servants walked through the rooms quietly as though afraid to make too much noise. Martha spent her days walking through the gardens and sitting in her study, reading through letters and documents, making sure everything was in order. There was a quiet power in her now, a strength she had never realized she possessed. But the real work, the true test, was still ahead of her. George and Frank had not yet accepted their defeat. Martha knew it wouldn't be long before they would come back, trying to assert their control once again. Their resentment toward her was not just about the estate, it was about pride. And pride, Martha understood, was a dangerous thing. She knew they were capable of anything, but she also knew that she had to remain strong. The estate wasn't just a building, it was a living legacy. The land had been in the family for generations, passed down from her ancestors, and it was her responsibility to protect it. Protect it from the forces within her own family that sought to tear it apart. Late one evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the land, Martha sat at the grand dining table, her eyes lost in thought. She was exhausted from the constant battles, both within and outside herself. The weight of the decisions she had made hung heavy on her shoulders, but she had no choice. She had done what she had to do. The sound of a car engine pulling into the driveway snapped her from her reverie. Martha's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked the emotion. She knew who it was before the footsteps echoed through the hallways. The door to the dining room opened and there stood George, his face drawn and pale. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable, a mixture of guilt, shame and something else, something Martha couldn't quite place. Behind him was Frank, looking equally as defeated, though he hid it more successfully than George did. Martha didn't speak right away. She simply looked at them, her eyes unwavering. She had already made her decision. Now it was time for them to make theirs. "You've come back," Martha said quietly, her voice softer than it had been before. "I didn't expect it to be this soon." George and Frank exchanged a brief glance before George spoke, his voice rough as though he had been holding back tears. "We've made a mistake, Mother," he said, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. "We were wrong. We thought we were entitled to this place, but we see now that we were wrong. It's yours. It always has been." Frank, usually the more stubborn of the two, nodded slowly. "We let our greed cloud our judgment. And we've hurt you. And for that we're sorry." Martha looked at her sons for a long moment, studying their faces. The sincerity in their words was undeniable, but so was the deep, painful regret that lingered in their eyes. She could see that they had realized, perhaps too late, what truly mattered. But Martha knew that words alone weren't enough. She had been through too much to simply forgive and forget. The estate wasn't just about money, it was about family, legacy, and the respect that had been lost over the years. "It's not just about the estate, George," Martha said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of pain and sacrifice. "It's about respect. About understanding what's truly important. What your father and I built wasn't just for us. It was for all of us. But we've lost that respect over the years. And that's something I don't know if I can get back." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was filled with a heavy silence. George and Frank stood there, visibly torn, unsure of what to say next. They had come expecting to beg for forgiveness, but they had not expected Martha's words to be so harsh, so real. Martha stood up from the table, walking toward the window that overlooked the vast estate. She watched the last of the sunlight dip below the horizon, the land bathed in a soft golden glow. It was beautiful. But it was also a reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything that was still at stake. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said, her voice steady, though it held a depth of emotion that sent a shiver down her spine. "Not until you show me that you understand what you've done. Not until you prove that you've learned from this." The tension in the room deepened. George and Frank looked at each other, their faces full of regret, but Martha could see something else in their eyes. Determination. They weren't going to give up this time. They had been humbled, but they were ready to fight for their place, for their family. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that the estate wasn't just theirs by birthright. It had to be earned. "We'll do whatever it takes, Mother," George said, his voice firm. "We'll prove that we're worthy of your trust again. I promise." Frank nodded in agreement. "We'll make it right." Martha turned away from the window, her eyes meeting their gazes. "This is not just about proving yourself to me," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's about proving to yourselves that you can be the men your father and I always hoped you would be. You've lost something that can never be replaced. But if you truly want to make it right, it's not about what you can take. It's about what you can give." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sons standing in the silence of their regret. They had come to claim what they thought was theirs, but in the end, it was Martha who had shown them what truly mattered. Martha's journey was a testament to resilience, perseverance, and the power of family ties. Betrayed by those she loved most, she was forced to confront her own vulnerability and rebuild everything she had worked for. Through emotional struggles and difficult decisions, she proved that legacy isn't just about inheritance. It's about values, honor, and responsibility. Her story teaches us the importance of reevaluating relationships, learning from past mistakes, and embracing the courage to make tough decisions. In life, the path to healing and growth often requires reclaiming control, even when it feels impossible. Will we, too, learn to build with integrity and compassion, or will we be lost to our own pride and greed? The choice is ours.